Welcome to my brief overview of research we've been conducting into inclusive learning spaces and special educational needs. My name's Ben Cleveland. I'm one of the co-directors of the Learning Environments Applied Research Network, a unique collaboration between the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning and the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and at times working with the Melbourne School of Medicine. This work is something we've been investigating for a little while now, a couple of years, and looking to expand into the near future. Having conducted research over the last decade into the design and occupation of school environments, we realised a few years ago that there was a significant gap in the research regarding the accommodation of students with special needs across a very broad spectrum of disability. And with support from internal seed funding from our own research group and also a research development grant from the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, we started expanding on this investigation a couple of years ago. While publications arising from our research have been sparse to date, we have published this article in The Conversation, in which we unsurprisingly argue that students with disabilities need inclusive buildings, but more so that an extensive program of research and evaluation was needed in order to provide the evidence base required to design effective inclusive buildings. So the overall aims of this research, which we are describing as more of a program of research rather than just an individual project, are as follows. To promote evidence-based knowledge generation about the design and use of special educational needs learning spaces, to create a range of agile evaluation tools for SEN spaces to reveal what works and what doesn't, to improve the design of learning spaces for students with special educational needs, and of course the ultimate objective, to improve the educational experiences of students with special education needs, their educators, families and auxiliary staff, basically all involved. Over the past decade, many new special education schools have been designed in Victoria and elsewhere around Australia, including this one, which has been quite noteworthy, Officer Specialist School. It has acted as something of a pivot between some historic design thinking and some more contemporary approaches to designing special education facilities. Certainly exploring the transit spaces as more active and participatory environments has led to significant changes in the way people are thinking about these facilities. Armstrong Creek School also has played a significant role in shifting the way people think about the intersection between design and students with disability, a school which accommodates approximately 30% of the total enrolments as students with disability, and therefore 70% of the students being mainstream. Certainly a unique project in the Victorian context and indeed in the Australian context, and one which we think requires significant exploration and understanding of how it's working. Having been a member of the design team for this project, I'm personally extremely interested in where the design intentions behind the architecture and the lived experience of those occupying the environments have met. Of course, in addition to the general learning areas, there are many specialised spaces such as this retreat space and also outdoor environments which have been designed with inclusion in mind. We believe thinking about these issues, both through ideas about diversity, inclusion, and also participation, to be particularly important, as documented in this book by Christine Eames and Dido Green, in which colleagues Wes Eames, Chris Bradbeer and myself have written a chapter. We see a progression from diversity as an appreciation of the needs that need to be accommodated, to inclusivity being an aspiration for actually doing so, through to participation, which is really, in our minds, much more about the lived experience. Architectural design in this field over the past couple of decades has revolved largely around the principles of universal design, and while offering a very useful starting point, we certainly believe acting on these principles isn't enough. The 7 principles of universal design offer a great framework for addressing access and inclusion across a wide range of fields, not only in architecture but in other design disciplines. But as I said, there's an increasing recognition that each type of project requires its own information and evidence base. So our overall objective is to go beyond universal design to provide the specific data needed to inform effective inclusive living space design and also understandings of its effective inhabitation. So we hope to generate new knowledge by reframing an approach through ideas of participation and also some concepts we refer to as affordance ecologies, to produce new tools for both research and evaluation, to obviously share the new insights, and also to engage with experimental and experiential modes of testing how the spatial affordances of different types of environments can create an inclusive setting for education. And finally, I should mention that we're currently in the process of drawing together a multidisciplinary group of researchers and also industry and government partners for an ARC linkage project application we hope to lodge a little later this year. And with that, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing from others in this forum. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Niku Javadi. I'm a PhD candidate in Design Research Group for Health and Wellbeing at University of South Australia and perioperative registered nurse. The research I've been doing is looking at application of co-designing augmented and virtual reality interventions to reduce anxiety in perioperative patient journey. My research is really important because perioperative anxiety is a common reaction exhibited by up to 80% of patients who are scheduled for surgical procedures and characterized by psychological and physiological changes which may affect their perioperative period. 1 in 10 Australians experiences tomophobia, the fear or anxiety caused by forthcoming surgical procedures and/or medical interventions. The anxiety severity widely differs among patients, and it is usually associated with the following factors: sociodemographic factors, psychological factors, anything related to the specific type of surgery, possible complications of the operation, methods of anesthesia, and preoperative information. In particular, 3 main causes of perioperative anxiety are categorized as the fear of the unknown, the idea of being sick, and the possibility of life ending. This is a draft perioperative patient journey map of my research. Through patient journey mapping, we can identify potential blind spots and work on the solutions to these problems. This also provides an opportunity to find improvements that can be made, as well as discovering opportunities for innovation. Emerging pieces of evidence show how perioperative anxiety starts as soon as the procedure is planned and reaches its peak on the day of surgery. High levels of anxiety actually increase the risk of infection, takes longer for wounds to heal, more likely to get postoperative depression, staying longer in hospital, and can even add to the amount of postoperative pain, nausea, and vomiting, which is horrible and can affect surgical outcome and the postoperative recovery. Further, patients with anxiety tend to have a decreased postoperative satisfaction and to be less compliant with their rehabilitation and occupational therapy. Distressed patients may be unable to understand and recall information, rendering them unable to provide consent for their operation. Interestingly, about just 10 to 30% of information provided to patients prior to their surgical procedure can be retained by them. Therefore, it's important to develop tools and strategies to mitigate this happening where possible. The concept of digital health has an increasingly important role in healthcare provision. The global healthcare market for augmented and virtual reality, known collectively as immersive technologies, is promising technologies that continue to gain momentum as a powerful diagnostic tool and aid in the treatment and management of patients in clinical settings. A growing body of research shows that technology-based therapeutic tools can be effective, acceptable, and cost-effective for many aspects of healthcare delivery. It is possible to find 2 main approaches to achieve such aims across the literature. This research explores what types of augmented and virtual reality technologies might be used and what sort of content should be shared with patients using these technologies. Broadly speaking, we are looking at two types of augmented and virtual reality content. The first one is focused on generic environments filled with relaxing narratives to induce control over one's own body and physiological response, while the second one engages the user in virtual and augmented reality mediated activities to empower his or her own abilities to regulate emotion and information. For achieving the goals of this study, I am going to use qualitative research method in three different phases, including contextual review on existing literature, expert network interviews by using Policy Delphi method, and development of co-design workshops with patient representatives. I have already started phase 1, which is ongoing, and phase 2 by running interviews with experts. After gathering all data and analyzing them, the research will aim to identify which patient populations and which software packages at what stage of perioperative environment receive greatest benefit from augmented and virtual reality technologies to improve patient experience and outcomes. Then we'll deliver a set of guiding principles and practices for how these types of interventions might be deployed. This is a hope that I can continue this research to commercialize it. My plan is that the outcome of this research can then be trialed in the hospital for people about to have a surgery who report feeling of being anxious or worried to improve perioperative patient experience. Harnessing the power of these technologies, hospitals can create an immersive environment that can minimize stress and enhances the perioperative experience. Thank you so much for your time and listening to my presentation.
Hi, I'm Katrina Kenner and I'm presenting a study from my PhD titled Depression and a Lack of Social Interaction Contribute to High Levels of Boredom in Stroke Rehabilitation. And I would like to acknowledge my co-authors. Boredom is an aversive experience of having an unfulfilled desire to be engaged in satisfying activity. Boredom can be thought of as a signal, which tells us we need to change a situation to make it more satisfying. How well we adaptively respond to the boredom signal determines if boredom is momentary or prolonged. Unresolved prolonged boredom in hospital is a problem because it may affect stroke survivors' mood and engagement in rehabilitation and subsequent recovery following stroke. Boredom arises when a situation lacks meaning or stimulation from the environment is not equally matched with available cognitive resources. For example, a tired stroke survivor could be overstimulated, or an alert stroke survivor could be understimulated. Meaning or stimulation levels are affected by the interaction between personal factors of the stroke survivor and environmental factors of the rehabilitation unit. As well as being a direct cause of boredom, these personal and environmental factors may interact and constrain stroke survivors from responding effectively to the boredom signal. So going a little bit more detail into the personal environmental factors. Personal factors may include reduced physical capacity that increases dependence on staff, reduced cognitive capacity due to attentional deficits or fatigue that may deplete cognitive resources, and executive dysfunction which may limit effective behavioural responses to the boredom signal. Control value appraisals, which include feelings of capability and control over how time is spent in rehabilitation, and the value or meaning stroke survivors associate with activities. Personality factors such as an increased tendency to experience boredom and a stroke survivor's emotional state. Environmental factors include the built environment, such as poor accessibility, wayfinding difficulties, single patient rooms, which may increase loneliness and isolation, and unappealing spaces, which may limit cognitive stimulation. The social environment and interaction with other stroke survivors, visitors, and staff. The rehabilitation-focused environment, which considers opportunities for therapeutic activity and practice across the 24-hour day. And service organisation, which includes staff time constraints, hospital rules and policies, and system pressures which impact staff and patient behaviour. So putting these ideas together, we have developed a framework that conceptualises boredom in stroke rehabilitation. So the aim of this study was to explore the influence of various personal and environmental factors on predicting boredom. This was an exploratory sub-study within a multi-site before-after controlled trial. Boredom levels were measured in 91 stroke survivors who received usual care and 69 stroke survivors with access to a patient-driven model of activity promotion. Boredom was measured using a 5-point Likert scale on average 13 days after rehabilitation admission. This scale was later dichotomised so that those stroke survivors who indicated they were bored about half the time or more were considered to have high levels of boredom. Outcome measures were chosen to operationalise categories of the conceptual framework. So physical capacity was operationalised by a measure of mobility, cognitive capacity with a measure of fatigue, control value appraisals with a measure of self-efficacy, and emotional state with a measure of depression. Environmental factors were measured using behavioural mapping, in which stroke survivors were observed at 10-minute intervals throughout the day, and their location, people present, and activity recorded. The built environment was represented by the time patients spent in their room, in communal areas, and whether they went outside. The social environment by the time patients spent in social interaction and alone, and a rehabilitation-focused environment by having access to the activity promotion intervention, time spent in therapy sessions, and time spent inactive outside of therapy. Factors that may influence boredom more broadly were also included, such as age, sex, stroke severity, and hospital site. To explore all of these boredom predictors, multivariable logistic regressions were performed in blocks using a hierarchical approach. So the results. 39% of participants made up the high boredom group. The characteristics of participants were similar between the boredom groups. However, those in the high boredom group had higher levels of depression and spent less time in social interaction with others. And it was these two factors that were the only factors that predicted high boredom levels in the final logistic regression model. So in conclusion, rehabilitation unit design features that enhance mood and provide greater opportunity for socialisation may assist in preventing stroke survivor boredom, enhancing engagement in rehabilitation and subsequent recovery following stroke. Thank you.
Hi, my health economic doctoral research into capital funding for acute facilities contained an exercise comparing the benefits to patients and hospital operations of specific design versus generic design for specialties. Two things have come to us from the 1990s. The first was that acute facilities can be generic, that they can be expanded to have flexible space to allow future-proofing. The second one is that Roger Ulrich's medical research found that people are healthier if they look at images of nature rather than of hospitals. My question to you, though, is can we now use evidence-based medicine, clinical guidelines, and the tools of evidence-based design to enable greater clinical effectiveness and improve patient experience, adopting contemporary technology, updating buildings, and enhancing medical equipment access? Comparing designing for flexibility or designing for specificity using clinical pathways are used as an evaluation tool, the Australian Public Hospitals Performance Indicator Framework. If you look at the area in black, you can see the key aspects. I used qualitative and quantitative measures to compare the generic approach, which has additional space for flexibility, or the specific approach for 36% of Australian patients in medical, surgical and obstetric DRGs. Capital has its own requirements that are specific Those are a sound basis for future investment and the ability to manage short-term foreseeable change. When comparing the flexible or generic approach with the highly specific approach to health facility design, it became evident that dynamic efficiency was a key determinant. Patient expectations, clinical and technological change, patient demand increases and innovation were not successfully incorporated into the generic model. They were in the clinical pathway model. Robert Solow in 1967 won the Nobel Prize for identifying the powerful influence of innovation on improving effectiveness and efficiency. We have yet to incorporate that into the way we design health facilities. The analysis found there were costs for generic design. The costs were borne by patients and through clinical effectiveness, but mostly in operational costings. When specifically designed clinical pathways were used, the patient experience was enhanced. The smoothness of the clinical pathway provided for a better experience for the patients, but also led to improved clinical effectiveness. Where specific evidence-based practice was used, access to appropriate technology enhanced clinical effectiveness further. The key finding, though, was that operational cost savings were found due to those clinical improvements, due to patient experiences being improved. These were most powerfully found in orthopedics and also in some of the other surgical diagnosis groups that I looked at. The sound basis for future investment and service development was best served by evidence-based clinical pathway, patient-specific design. And I thought about this for a bit based on the evidence that came to me. And it seemed that where people were designing for what they thought would be happening in the future, they made the best assumptions that they could, provided the flexibility of space that they could. But they were not able to always predict the future with unerring certainty. Part of the problem is that funding for hospitals and for acute health facilities is so infrequent. People make the best estimates that they can to enable the facility to get through this period of time it's expected to manage. Where you have patient-based, evidence-based design, you also require regular and frequent funding to permit frequent updating of the facilities to be appropriate for the different ranges of patients, the different clinical experiences, the different clinical regimes that are coming in place. I believe part of the problem that we've experienced is the compulsion to predict the future, when the task of engineers and architects should be to enable the future, design for now, but with one eye on the future, confident that there will be continuous improvement associated with funding. So while all architects that I know in the health sphere say form follows function, I would argue that my research has found that form follows finance. And if we can get the finance right, we can get the design right. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Rebecca McLaughlin, and I'd like to present my current research project, Designing for Palliative Care. This is a 3-year project funded by the Australian Research Council that investigates the perception and use of healthcare spaces. Specifically, how do healthcare environments make people feel, and how can they best support staff in the delivery of patient care? While the second question needs little justification, the first doesn't always seem so important. So before we get into the project itself, let me explain to you why it is. How healthcare spaces look and feel contributes to patient anxiety, and that anxiety impacts well-being. Now, I'm using well-being here as a catch-all for a set of ideas we're all likely familiar with: decreased need for analgesics, improved recovery times, and particularly relevant to palliative care, a willingness to engage with hospital care in the first place. Another concern with particular significance for palliative care, but also paediatric care, is the impact of hospital surroundings on family members. Because we know that if a family member anxiety is increased, then that has a knock-on effect for the patient's own well-being. So we're currently in the process of talking to patients, family members, healthcare professionals, architects, hospital administrators, and government representatives. This last group, because we're committed to understanding the constraints of hospital design and procurement so that we can ensure the design advice we offer can actually be implemented by design professionals, because it takes account of all the various obstacles and challenges to getting hospitals built. Now, if you've noticed a switch in language to we, that's because along the way, I've been lucky to recruit this exceptional group of people to work with me in carrying out this research. So let's talk about methods. We'll be undertaking photo response interviews with patients and family members across 4 hospital sites. So we're working with hospitals in Melbourne, Sydney, and Newcastle. We've conducted an online survey of 90 palliative care professionals across Australia. We've conducted 25 interviews with architects, hospital administrators, directors of palliative care services, and government representatives across Victoria, New South Wales, the UK, and the USA. And we'll look to conduct another 5 to 8 of those. Finally, we've created an online research platform that the public are invited to engage with, and you can visit that at www.palliativecare.design. So these are the photographs we're using in our interviews. These are all facilities in which palliative care is currently delivered here and around the world. So in addition to asking patients and families to talk to us about the hospital spaces they're currently experiencing, we use these photographs as talking points to flesh out how people respond to different kinds of architectural environments. So a number of these images were also used in the online staff survey, so that will give us an opportunity to see whether there's a consensus between what patients, families, and staff want from a palliative care environment, or if they're looking for different spatial affordances and characteristics. And here's a sneak peek at the research we're currently writing up. So finally, I'll share with you just a couple of the more interesting things we've found in our research so far. Within the process of designing new palliative care facilities, carpet and opening windows are 2 of the most controversial issues. Yet we identified a number of facilities where both of these things had been successfully implicated, suggesting there's something else going on here, whether that be a lack of knowledge around what's possible, ongoing staff perceptions about concerns of safety, or procurement processes that simply don't support implementing non-standard solutions. So the important factor here is not a question of whether or not we should have carpet, but that carpet reveals a broader story about the hidden obstacles to moving beyond standard practice in the design of healthcare facilities. The second thing we've found is that palliative care professionals display an acute awareness of compromises to patient and family comfort and routinely prioritise patient needs above their own when asked what would improve their work environment. What we've observed across both our staff survey and interviews is that where the quality of the environment doesn't match up to the quality of care that staff aspire to deliver, this becomes a source of frustration. The opportunity here is that improvements made for the benefit of patient and family comfort should, in turn, positively impact staff well-being. To finish, here are our details if you'd like to get in touch with us. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Julia. Today I'm presenting on factors that influence communication in rehabilitation. My PhD is investigating interprofessional teamwork and interprofessional communication, which is how teams communicate together as they work towards patient goals in rehabilitation. There are positive outcomes associated with effective interprofessional communication relating to patient health outcomes, safety and satisfaction. But what has this got to do with rehabilitation facility design? So in the research, my PhD, I've conducted a literature review and an empirical qualitative research study, which involved interviewing 24 healthcare professionals across Australia and New Zealand. And the data shows that as well as the people engaging in interprofessional communication, the spaces in which they work and the tools in which they use while they're communicating all influence communication. And this is where I think it will be relevant to people considering the design of rehabilitation facilities. So first I'll talk about places, and I'm going to use some quotes from my interview study to describe how communication is influenced by the places in which people work. So this quote says, because the offices are interdisciplinary, there's so much of that informal dynamic conversation, problem-solving stuff that goes on. And this is a speech pathologist who's discussing an allied health interdisciplinary office in which she engages in lots of rich discussion, which has been shown in the literature to be very important to how teams engage in communication and patient care. So this sounds like a really wonderful setup in terms of how the team communicates. But when I probed a bit further about how she then goes on to communicate with other people in the team, such as nurses and doctors, she says this: it's a big effort, you know. If you want to go and ask the nurses something, then you trudge up the hallway and, you know, very rarely does anyone come down. So this is showing how, in one way, the space in which she works really facilitates interdisciplinary communication, but that's only within allied health staff. And then there's actually a barrier caused by the physical layout of the rehab unit between the allied health staff and the doctors and the nurses. The other thing that has been interesting in the literature is there was a lack of information about the tools that people use in communication. And I thought this was quite interesting because we all use a variety of tools in the way we engage in communication, especially because of COVID. We've been engaging in new high-tech ways of communicating more recently than in the past and what was shown in the literature. So I made sure I focused on this in my qualitative research. And what we found is there's a range of tools that are used in rehab settings. Some are high-tech, such as smart devices and online data sharing platforms, electronic medical records, and some are very low-tech, written patient notes, whiteboards on at a patient's bedside, you know, exercise sheets stuck up on a patient's wall, things like that. And usually it was a combination of both that people are using on a day-to-day basis. But the way people engage with these tools varied a lot depending on the physical setting in which they worked. So this is a quote from a dietitian who's working in a setting where they've recently introduced electronic medical records. And she says, allied health go off to their separate areas. So, you know, it's very hard to find an allied health member, and that's definitely changed the way we communicate and work together. So she has described earlier in the interview that previously they would all communicate a lot in that informal way that we know is important in how interprofessional teams work. They do that around the nurses' station as they wrote their paper notes. But now they have to write electronic notes. They have to go to separate offices, which are not located close to the ward. And she's finding there's a big, that's a barrier to how they engage in the rest of their communication and verbal communication. This quote is from a registered nurse who's working in a nice new facility, and she's commented that because it's a new hospital, we're actually not allowed to have things stuck on the wall. And when she's talking about this, she was describing a patient's bedroom in which there was a lot of paper that and written documentation that allied health and nurses were trying to put up on the walls, but they weren't actually allowed to put it there because of the new layout of the hospital, and that actually was creating a barrier between how the staff wanted to work and wanted to communicate and how the physical setting was allowing them to do so. So when we think about this data and what this has to do with rehab facility design, we've seen that their patient outcomes are related to interprofessional communication. We can see that the way that spaces and tools are used influences how people communicate within rehab teams. So when we're thinking about facility design and with the goal to optimise rehabilitation through design, interprofessional communication and how people communicate within those spaces, and also the tools that might be integrated into those spaces, is important to consider in that overall goal to optimise patient care.
Hello, today I will be discussing the results of my main PhD study, which was a virtual reality study involving stroke survivors that was done in collaboration with the Florey Institute, Melbourne School of Design and Swinburne University. As you can see here, we conducted this study to determine how we could link the responses of people after stroke to the physical environment of the patient room. Our independent variable was a purpose-built 3D immersive audiovisual physical environment of two different hospital patient room types. We included people with broad stroke severity and cognitive ability, whereby the time post-stroke was not critical, but it must have been in the last 3 years. So for this study, we primarily aimed to assess the feasibility of using VR in the design of stroke environments. And secondly, we aimed to show that we could determine differences in choice preference and affective rating responses that stroke survivors make when comparing between alternatives and in the context of 1 to 4 additional physical design attributes. So for this study, it was an experimental cross-sectional fractional factorial design to explore and compare stroke survivor responses. We had baseline single patient and multi-patient room 3D VR simulation scenarios. There were 16 in the day and 16 in the nighttime, meaning that each participant was immersed in 32 individual VR scenarios, where one physical design feature was changed in each of the 32. And this allowed us to more fully examine participants' exposure to social connectivity, outdoor greenery view, nighttime noise, horizontal room size, and include both day and night conditions. This is a picture of one of our stroke participants using the experimental setup, which was the same HTC Vive goggles and the same Sennheiser 500A headphones, which was conducted in the same room in the Florey Institute, and this room had the door closed all the time and had no windows. This slide shows the perspective of the patient participant, where in all of the VR conditions, their perspective was sitting upright in the bed, facing the TV screen, which is at the foot of the bed. On the right was the entrance to the room and the doorway to the bathroom with the sink outside, which is easily recognisable as a hospital room. And on the left, there was always a window of the same size in all the VR conditions with equal illuminance coming through from the window. And similarly in the nighttime, which you can see at the bottom of the screen, the shadowing and the light was the same in all of the conditions. This is a summary slide of the entire study cohort. As you can see, we have them clustered into less than 55 years of age, greater than 55 years, less than 65 years, and more than 65 years of age. As you can see, most of the whole cohort were male, as you can see in this top row here, and most of the group were over 65. We did have some spread across the different time periods for being in hospital for their stroke, with most of them in less than 7 days. And according to a measure of cognitive injury, the MOCA score, most of the group scored high, indicating they didn't have much cognitive injury post-stroke. and also the majority of people in the groups had never experienced VR before. So how do we answer our research questions? Well, firstly, we needed to be able to demonstrate feasibility of the study, and we did that by showing that more than 90% of the study group elected to complete all the day and the night simulations with no adverse events and no dropouts. And we answered our secondary objectives with the repeated measures of the study design using regression analysis for the VAS, numerical choice preference responses, and the Pick-a-Mood scale affective responses. And we supplemented this by doing thematic analysis in 35 semi-structured interviews using the qualitative description method. And this is one slide of the daytime results for the Pick-a-Mood affective states, which, without going through it in too much detail, allows you to show how the different expressions of the categorical types of emotional response can be associated with different physical design features. And as you can see, the significance level is denoted by the asterisks. And this is the summary slide from the interviewing sub-study, where you can see that the resulting 3 themes contained the majority of the codes that we found from the interviews. And those overarching themes are action, care, forward by design and layout, connection to people, place and nature, and control of the environment influenced by furnishings, space and sound. So in conclusion, we found that audiovisual stimuli can be used in a VR physical environment to test and explore how people after stroke respond to their hospital environment. We also found that people with stroke and mild cognitive injury can make factorial comparisons between design alternatives. And using this method, it seems that predominantly the patient room occupancy influences their choice, whether it's in the day or the night, and that some contextual features can moderate patient affective states, for example, daytime plus greenery exposure in the multi-patient room design. Thank you.